Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is where we take that monumental stack of sources, the articles, the
Yeah.
research, the critical theory, and distill it all down into the core knowledge you need to really grasp the greatest minds and the biggest ideas shaping our world.
And today we are undertaking a pretty ambitious deep dive into the life and work of a genuine intellectual giant.
Absolutely. A figure who fundamentally reshaped modern evolutionary thought, Stephen Jay Gould.
Gould, who lived from 1941 to 2002, was not just a scientist working in one field. I mean, that's the first thing you have to understand. He was an incredibly rare figure.
A polymath, really.
Totally. A leading paleontologist, a pioneering evolutionary biologist, an incredibly sharp historian of science, and maybe most importantly for his fame, he was the most widely read and influential popular science author of his entire generation.
That dual identity is so key, isn't it? The
Yeah.
rigorous academic on one side and then this incredibly eloquent public communicator on the other.
It's everything. He spent his professional career at Harvard and as a curator at the American Museum of Natural History. But to the world, he was known for his astonishing ability to translate these complex, often really heated scientific debates into prose that was witty, accessible, and just profoundly thought-provoking.
Right. So our mission today is to give you a rapid but still remarkably thorough understanding of his biggest contributions.
Exactly. We want to unpack his most significant scientific innovations, his central philosophical critiques that, actively disrupted the assumptions of mainstream evolutionary theory, and the major intellectual controversies he just fearlessly ignited.
We want you to walk away with a comprehensive, nuanced picture of this extremely complex thinker.
For sure.
Okay, so let's get into it. And we really have to start with the origin story. I mean, the definitive moment his life's trajectory was just set.
It's a great story. Gould always recalled being 5 years old. His father took him to the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and there he came face to face with the magnificent Tyrannosaurus rex specimen, AMNH 5027.
And he was just hooked.
Completely and utterly awestruck. He talked about the sheer scale, the deep history just sitting there in those bones. He later said that in that exact instant, seeing that physical monument to deep time, he decided his life's work would be to become a paleontologist.
And he never wavered. That level of childhood commitment, which he never deviated from, it just grounds his entire career in the physical evidence, in the rocks.
It really does. And it sets the stage for a career that was defined by challenging assumptions. So we'll be navigating three main areas today to really encapsulate the breadth of his influence.
Moving from the technical science to a much broader social critique.
Right. First, we'll examine his primary scientific innovation, the one that completely changed how biologists look at the fossil record, the theory of punctuated equilibrium.
Then second, we're going to dive into his major philosophical critique of the reigning dogma, the Spandrels critique of adaptationism.
Which fundamentally questioned the assumption that every single biological trait is a product of direct natural selection.
And then finally, we'll explore his significant societal role. We'll focus on his proposal for, let's say, an intellectual truce between science and religion, non-overlapping Magisteria, or NOMA, and his incredibly influential and often highly controversial work of social history, the Mismeasure of Man.
It's a lot to cover, but it's all connected.
Let's begin with the man himself. The man who spent nearly 3 decades as the public face of evolutionary science. Gould was born in Queens, New York in 1941. He was raised in a secular Jewish home, and that really shaped his approach to faith.
Oh, absolutely. His approach to ultimate reality was just rooted in skepticism. Although he respected, the domain of religion, he firmly identified as an agnostic.
He had a great quote about that.
He did. He said, "Agnosticism is the only honorable position because we really cannot know." And that deep-seated skepticism wasn't just about theology. It was the foundation of his approach to all knowledge. It demanded rigorous evidence and a willingness to question even the most deeply held assumptions.
And that skepticism, it seems, also fueled his political consciousness.
For sure. If you look at his politics, he was decidedly to the left of center. He was heavily influenced by mid-century critical sociology, specifically C. Wright Mill's huge work, The Power Elite.
Which was all about the intertwined nature of governmental, corporate, and military leaders.
Exactly. And he was also deeply affected by the writings of Noam Chomsky, particularly Chomsky's critiques of state power and media. This background is so vital because it establishes the framework for his later attacks on biological determinism.
I see. So if he saw oppression being driven by elites in politics, he was naturally going to look for it in science too.
Precisely. He was inclined to question whether science itself was being used, maybe unconsciously, to justify societal inequality.
And this wasn't just an intellectual exercise for him. His activism started very early on.
Very early. While he was at Antioch College in the early 1960s, he was profoundly active in the civil rights movement, focused on challenging these entrenched discriminatory practices.
There's a fantastic story from his time in the UK as well.
There is. He was visiting undergraduate at the University of Leeds, and he organized weekly demonstrations outside a dance hall in Bradford because they refused to admit Black people.
And he just kept at it.
He was relentless. He maintained that campaign until the policy was finally and successfully revoked. And that anecdote, I mean, it might seem small in the scale of his global career, but it just illustrates this profound, lifelong dedication to combating oppression. It completely foreshadows his commitment to exposing the biases lurking beneath the surface of certain scientific claims.
What's truly remarkable, though, is how he balanced this intense academic rigor and political commitment with such genuinely broad and, frankly, sort of idiosyncratic personal interests. He wasn't just a scientist.
No, he was a full person. I mean, his love of the New York Yankees was legendary.
He wasn't just a fan, right? He was a statistician.
An amateur sabermetrician, yeah, long before that became a whole field. He's obsessive. He even collected baseball cards. He wrote these extensive, brilliant essays dissecting the sport, often using baseball stats as analogies for evolutionary phenomena.
Which were later collected in his book, Triumph and Tragedy in Mudville. But his cultural life went way beyond baseball.
Oh, way beyond. He was heavily invested in the arts. He sang baritone in the Boston Cecilia, which is a major choral society. He was an absolute aficionado of Gilbert and Sullivan operas.
And he was a collector.
A collector of rare antiquarian books and a true polyglot. He spoke French, German, Russian, and Italian. He loved architecture, loved taking long city walks, and he would often connect the physical structures of the human world to the constrained structures he saw in biology.
And that breadth of interest, that was really the secret weapon in his popular writing, wasn't it?
It was everything. He could pull analogies and examples from virtually any corner of human culture to eliminate some obscure paleontological point.
And that writing was just prolific. His main public platform was, of course, Natural History magazine,
where he published a stunning total of 300 popular essays between 1974 and 2001.
That monumental run was called This View of Life,
which was a direct homage to the famous last passage of Darwin's On the Origin of Species. And these essays, they were the bedrock of his public influence. They formed the core of his best-selling books, like Ever Since Darwin, The Panda's Thumb,
The Flamingo's Smile. His stature just grew so immense that the U.S. Library of Congress named him a living legend in 2000.
He became a true celebrity scientist. He was on major TV programs like Novia and Charlie Rose. And, you know, in a move that signals true cultural saturation, he even voiced himself on The Simpsons.
And there's a great story about that, too.
Oh, yeah, and this is where his meticulousness shows again. The script introduced him as the world's most brilliant paleontologist.
And he objected.
He objected. He insisted they change the line because he thought the hyperbole was misleading and, you know, unnecessary. He was rigorous even about his own fame.
Now, we mentioned rigor in critical thinking. His perspective on life, on science, and on the arbitrary nature of statistics was perhaps most powerfully shaped by a personal crisis.
Yeah.
His first battle with cancer.
That's right. In July 1982, he was diagnosed with peritoneal mesothelioma. It's an incredibly deadly cancer, often associated with asbestos exposure.
Which he may have encountered at Harvard.
It's possible, yeah, while working in the older sections of the Museum of Comparative Zoology. The diagnosis was just devastating. He was given this grim statistical information about his prognosis.
But after a very difficult recovery, he wrote what became one of his most influential essays. The median isn't the message.
He published it in 1985. And that essay is just a profound lesson in critical thinking, especially when you're faced with life-altering data.
Okay, so let's unpack that. How exactly did he get relief from looking at statistics that, on the surface, looked overwhelmingly negative?
Well, this is where we see the application of his insight. When he was diagnosed, the stated median mortality for his cancer was a mere 8 months.
Which would cause anyone to panic.
Of course. The instinct is to feel the clock ticking down to that statistical average. But Gould, the statistician, he realized that the median, the 50th percentile, is just an abstraction. It's a single point that tells you nothing about the full shape of the distribution.
So he looked past the average to the variability that spread.
Exactly. He correctly understood that mesothelioma mortality follows what's called a right-skewed distribution. This means a lot of patients die relatively quickly. They pull the average down, making that median low.
Oh.
But, and this is the crucial part, because it's right-skewed, there is a very long, substantial tail of outliers, people who survive for many, many years, even decades. He realized that with his age, his health, and modern treatment, he was positioned firmly in that long tail.
So the median was accurate, but it wasn't a prediction?
It was an accurate descriptive statistic, but it was totally useless as a predictive tool for any single individual, especially one getting the best care. It transforms the statistic from a death sentence into a map of possibility.
It's such a powerful application of academic knowledge to personal existential relief. And it's a reminder to you, the listener, to always ask what the shape of the data is, not just what the average is.
And that humanitarian thread continued into his treatment advocacy. He was a strong supporter of medical cannabis.
He used it himself during treatment.
He did. He revealed that during his own arduous treatment, he smoked marijuana to alleviate intense and uncontrollable nausea that conventional drugs just couldn't touch. And he argued so vehemently against withholding such a demonstrably beneficial substance from seriously ill patients just because others might use it recreationally.
His commitment to humane, evidence-based thinking was lifelong, right up until his death in 2002 from a lung cancer that was unrelated to the mesothelioma. He died, fittingly, in his Soho loft, surrounded by his family and, as the reports say, the many books he loved.
A fitting end for a man of letters and science.
Okay, now we transition fully from the intellectual life of the man to the revolutionary nature of his scientific mind. Let's tackle his most famous and impactful scientific idea, punctuated equilibrium.
Right. Before he developed this theory, he had established his academic credentials. Antioch College, with that rare double major in geology and philosophy.
Which is a perfect combination for what he was about to do.
It really was. Then a PhD from Columbia in 1967. He was hired immediately by Harvard, became a professor and the curator of invertebrate paleontology. So he had this deep training in both the hard science of rocks and fossils and the philosophical rigor to challenge the status quo.
And the theory of punctuated equilibrium, or PE, this was a joint effort with his colleague Niles Eldredge, published in 1972. And it fundamentally challenged the prevailing view of how fast evolution happens.
It really did. To get it, you have to understand the traditional view first. For decades, the dominant idea from Darwin was phyletic gradualism.
The idea that evolutionary change is always smooth, continuous, and marked by these slow, subtle, incremental transformations over vast geological time.
Exactly. The view suggested that if you looked at a fossil lineage, you should find this continuous chain of transitional forms documenting that slow, steady change.
And PE proposes an entirely different model.
A completely different picture. It argues that the history of life is dominated by long periods of stasis. That is, evolutionary stability, where species exist for millions of years with a little to no physical change.
And these long, boring periods are punctuated.
Infrequently but swiftly punctuated by periods of rapid branching speciation, a process called cladogenesis.
Okay, wait. If the change is swift, how rapid are we talking about? Does this mean PE is supporting that old pre-Darwinian idea of evolution by massive leaps, by saltation? That was a major criticism at the time, wasn't it?
That's a great question, and it's one Gould and Eldredge had to rigorously defend against. They were explicitly not arguing for saltation.
So not overnight changes.
Not at all. When they say swift, they mean swift in geological terms. A speciation event that takes, say, 50,000 to 100,000 years is way too slow for us to notice, but it's a blink of an eye in the fossil record, which operates on a scale of millions of years.
Ah, so it's faster than the millions of years required by strict gradualism, but still a long process by human standards.
Precisely. And that distinction is crucial. It explains a long-standing problem in paleontology, why we so rarely find those long, smooth sequences of transitional fossils.
Because the transitional period is just too brief and too geographically restricted to be routinely fossilized.
You've got it. And this leads to their proposed mechanism. PE is closely tied to the concept of allopatric speciation, as defined by Ernst Mayr. Eldredge and Gould suggested that most evolutionary change happens when small, isolated populations bring off from a large, central parent population.
And they move to the edge of the species range. Why is that so critical? Why do these small, isolated populations evolve so much faster?
It's down to two things: isolation and population genetics. The small size means genetic drift is way more intense, and any selective pressures they face in a new, maybe marginal environment are much stronger and more directional than the forces acting on the big, stable parent population.
So in these little pockets, rapid change can happen much more easily.
Far more easily. And once this new species is established, it often migrates back into the main range, maybe outcompetes the ancestor, and then it enters its own long period of stasis.
The impact of PE was just enormous. Gould argued it revised a key pillar in the central logic of Darwinian theory.
It shifted the focus from slow, steady, individual adaptation to the differential survival and stability of entire species themselves. The debate was, as you said, intense.
Critics tried to downplay it.
They did. They tried to claim it was just a trivial modification of neo-Darwinism, that rapid change was still just gradual change, sped up. But key figures in the field, like Ernst Mayr, they strongly emphasized the novelty. They argued that PE's focus on stasis, that remarkable stability of species, was the truly new concept, which traditional theory had just overlooked or dismissed as a lack of data.
And the academic banter around this is part of the legend. You have the critics joking about evolution by jerks.
But which Gould immediately turned on its head, labeling gradualism evolution by creeps. It shows how these serious, rigorous scientific disputes were conducted with a sharp, memorable, and often witty style designed to be heard beyond just the seminar room.
Now, beyond the pace of change, Gould also made foundational contributions to the then-emerging field of evolutionary developmental biology, or Evo-Devo.
Right. His big early work there, Ontogeny and Phylogeny, focused heavily on heterochrony, which is just a fancy word for changes in the relative timing of developmental events.
And he focused his analysis on two key processes. First, there's neoteny.
Neoteny. This happens when the timing of an organism's development is slowed down, so it ends up retaining juvenile or even larval features as an adult.
Like how humans retain certain juvenile features. Our large heads relative to our bodies are delayed maturation.
Exactly. Gould proposed that this retention of a juvenile flexible stage was crucial in human evolution, granting us this extended period of learning and plasticity.
And the second process is terminal addition.
Terminal addition, basically the opposite. The organism adds new developmental stages by speeding up or shortening its earlier existing stages. This lets you tack on entirely new traits to a stable developmental base, offering another way to get swift, non-gradual evolutionary change.
But he wasn't just a theorist. He always grounded his work in hard data, particularly in his technical work on land snails.
The West Indian genus Cimmerian, yes. This genus was his perfect, concrete illustration of punctuated equilibrium in action. Gould documented this unbelievable morphological diversity over 600 described species and subspecies.
With shells shaped like everything from golf balls to pencils.
Huge variation. But what he found was that despite this incredible physical variation, the species showed surprisingly little genetic difference. The change in form seemed to happen extremely rapidly, followed by long stability, a classic signature of PE.
And that diversity led to a great historical anecdote he loved to tell.
Yes. Gould lamented that if Christopher Columbus had just cataloged a single saurian shell when he arrived in the Americas, that one biological detail would have solved the huge scholarly debate over which specific island he first landed on because of the snail's unique geographical distribution.
It just highlights how much information is packed into the tiny details of the natural world if you know how to look.
Absolutely.
Okay, now we shift to what may be Gould's most profound philosophical challenge to biology. His critique of adaptationism.
Right. Gould was a tireless champion of evolutionary pluralism. He insisted that natural selection is powerful, but it does not and cannot explain every single biological feature we see.
He argued for acknowledging biological constraints and other non-selectionist forces.
And this all culminated in the landmark 1979 paper, The Spandrels of San Marco and the Panglossian Paradigm, which he co-wrote with his colleague Richard Lewontin. This piece wasn't just proposing a new mechanism, it proposed a whole new way of thinking.
Let's start with the architectural analogy, because the term spandrel comes from architecture, and you really have to visualize it.
You do.
Yeah.
So imagine you're inside a massive dome, like the San Marco Cathedral in Venice, which is where they got the idea. If you want to put a circular dome on top of a square room, you need 4 arches to hold it up.
Okay, I'm with you.
The spandrels are the triangular curved spaces that necessarily appear over the corners of those arches, connecting the arches to the circular base of the dome.
So the triangular space isn't the primary design feature. It's not what the architect was trying to build.
Exactly, the architect selected for the dome and the supporting arches. The triangular space, the spandrel, is simply a non-negotiable geometric byproduct of that decision. Now, once those spaces exist, architects often decorate them beautifully with mosaics, but their initial existence is not the result of selection for a decorative panel.
And the biological argument then becomes crystal clear. A biological spandrel is a feature that arises as a necessary side consequence, a byproduct of the selection of some other primary feature.
It's not directly selected for by natural selection, it's just carried along for the ride. And Gould and Lewontin proposed several examples. They pointed to the masculinized genitalia in female hyenas, suggesting that this might be an unavoidable consequence of high androgen levels selected for other reasons, like aggression.
And crucially, they also suggested that several key features of the human mind, our ability to make art, our complex consciousness, might be accidental, non-adaptive byproducts of having a massive, rapidly selected brain structure.
Which leads right to the second half of their critique, the Panglossian paradigm.
This is a brilliant literary jab.
It is. Dr. Pangloss, from Voltaire's Candide, famously insists that all is for the best in this best of all possible worlds, justifying every horror as an optimal outcome. Gould and Lewontin accuse strict adaptationist biologists of being Panglossian.
Of inventing plausible just-so stories for every trait they saw, rather than considering other explanations, like constraints or byproducts.
Exactly. The critique wasn't that selection doesn't happen. It was a demand for intellectual pluralism. It forced biologists to raise the evidential bar for adaptation claims.
A classic case study that later came to support this is the female orgasm.
Right, a subject Gould explored in his essay, Male Nipples and Clitoral Ripples, following work by Elizabeth Lloyd. The argument is that the clitoris and its ability to achieve orgasm may be a non-selected consequence of shared mammalian developmental pathways that are crucial for male genitalia, rather than a direct adaptation selected for in females.
Now, in a classic bit of academic metacritique, the term spandrel itself became a mini-controversy. The philosopher Daniel Dennett claimed the technically more precise term should have been pendentive.
It's a perfect example of academic minutia. But the core point held up. A civil engineering professor later confirmed that while the terms are often confused, Dennett's critique was a semantic distraction. Gould and Lewontin's overall analogy, the idea of a feature arising as an unintended byproduct, was fundamentally sound.
And to deal with these co-opted features, Gould later co-coined a necessary new term with the paleontologist Elizabeth Vrba, exaptation.
Exaptation. It's defined as a trait that evolved for one purpose or was an unselected byproduct and is later co-opted or repurposed to serve an entirely different function.
Give us a clear example.
Bird feathers. The evidence strongly suggests feathers initially evolved not for flight, but for thermoregulation for insulation. Once that trait was established, it was later exapted for flight.
So if we take that mechanism repurposing and apply it to human evolution, it takes on massive philosophical importance.
Absolutely. Gould believed that exaptation fundamentally undermined the premise of strict human sociobiology. He argued that many of our most complex functions, writing poetry, creating music, are not the result of direct selection for those specific abilities. They are unintended side consequences, exaptations of the massive increase in brain size that was selected for other, simpler reasons.
And this critique of adaptationism flows directly into his challenge of the concept of evolutionary progress.
He argued fiercely, especially in his book Full House, that evolution has no inherent direction, no pre-programmed ladder of progress leading toward organisms that are bigger, faster, or smarter, and most certainly no inevitable march toward humanity.
He used a particularly effective analogy he called the random walk.
Yeah, visualize this. Life has to begin at a left wall of minimal complexity. The first organisms, bacteria, are constrained to be simple. Now, if diversity starts at that simple point, any subsequent evolutionary change will, over time, spread out.
Some lineages will get more complex, some will get simpler.
Right. But since they can't go to the left, because the simple side is blocked by the starting point, the average complexity looks like it's increasing.
But it's a statistical illusion.
It's an illusion of trend. The most common form of life, remains simple bacteria. He showed that diversification causes the variance in complexity to increase, not necessarily the mean complexity, and he pointed to parasites, which constantly evolve towards simplification, as proof that there's no locked-in direction toward complexity.
That reframes the entire history of life from an ascent to an inevitable expansion of possibilities.
It does. But in Full House, he made a crucial distinction between biological evolution and a cultural evolution. He rejected biological progress, but he permitted a Lamarckian mechanism, the passing on of learned traits in culture.
And he used baseball stats to illustrate this.
The famous example is the disappearance of the .400 batting average. No one's hit .400 since 1941. Gould argued this wasn't because modern players are less skilled, but because the overall quality of pitching and defense has improved dramatically. This continuous improvement defined a cultural right wall of human limits.
A physical boundary that makes extreme outlier performance statistically less likely, even as the average performance goes up.
Exactly. The human limit is a biological constant, but the cultural system improves, making the peak harder to reach. It's a perfect example of how he connected his scientific principles to everyday culture.
The theoretical disagreements we've covered -PE, Spandrels, they didn't stay in academic journals, did they?
Not at all. They exploded into the public domain in the late 20th century in what were famously dubbed the Darwin Wars.
These battles were dramatic, often focusing on the application of sociobiology to humans. Gould found himself in a long-running public feud with major figures.
Most notably, his Harvard colleague E.O. Wilson, the founder of sociobiology, and prominent popularizers like Richard Dawkins and Steven Pinker.
The initial flashpoint was way back in 1975 with that public letter against sociobiology, which criticized Wilson's deterministic view of human society.
And Gould's stance here was highly nuanced and often misunderstood. He did not reject sociobiology outright. In fact, he readily acknowledged it had successfully clarified animal behavior, like altruism via kin selection.
But he drew a hard line when it came to humans.
A very hard line. He strongly rejected the deterministic application to humans, the idea that specific, complex human behaviors like aggression or gender roles are genetically hardwired products of selection.
His core counterargument was framed as the distinction between biological potentiality and biological determinism.
Exactly. He argued that the human brain, with its vast size and flexibility, is an instrument of immense potentiality. It permits a huge spectrum of opposite behaviors. We can be aggressive or peaceful, dominant or submissive, spiteful or generous.
And crucially, he argued that all of these contradictory behaviors are just as biological as any other.
Precisely. The genetic structure allows for the potential for conflict or cooperation. Which one predominates is overwhelmingly determined by culture. Adaptive behaviors can be passed on through culture just as plausibly as through genetics.
And that philosophical critique of determinism, that's what provided the impetus for his major work of history, The Mismeasure of Man.
Published in 1981, it immediately sparked massive, decades-long controversy. The book's central thesis was to provide a historical analysis of craniometry skull measuring and intelligence testing,
tracing both fields back to an unfounded but highly influential belief in biological determinism.
The idea that social and economic differences between groups, race, class, sex arose from inherited biological distinctions rather than from environment or politics.
The immediate controversy focused on his investigation of the 19th century craniometrist Samuel George Morton.
Right. Gould accused Morton of unconsciously manipulating or finagling his skull measurements to support his preconceived racial hierarchies, to show that Caucasian skulls were systematically larger.
And this is a perfect example of how a scientific narrative unfolds over time. After Gould's death, a 2011 study remeasured many of Morton's original skulls. They criticized Gould, arguing his measurements were incorrect and that Gould himself had been biased by his strong anti-racist convictions.
It seems like a strong rebuttal at the time. However, the academic debate didn't end there. A Nature editorial soon cautioned against rushing to accept that criticism, pointing out potential conflicts of interest. And more importantly, subsequent analysis shifted the focus back to Gould's broader point about bias.
So how was Gould's thesis ultimately vindicated, even if his claim about measurement errors was maybe overstated?
The definitive analysis came in 2018 from Paul Wolfe Mitchell, who used Morton's original unpublished statistical notes. And Mitchell concluded that while Gould may have slightly overstated the measurement errors themselves, his overall conclusion about Morton's fundamental interpretive bias was correct.
The bias wasn't in the measuring, but in the interpreting and reporting.
Exactly. Morton arbitrarily focused on small, convenient differences in average skull size, even though there was vast total overlap in skull size between all the groups he studied. Mitchell highlighted that one of Morton's contemporaries, Friedrich Tiedemann, had almost identical data, but used it to argue strongly against racial hierarchies because he focused on the overlap, not the averages.
So Gould's critique, that scientific claims are often deeply influenced by cultural assumptions was ultimately proven correct.
The message of the mismeasure of man survived the attack.
Beyond the societal implications, the Darwin Wars also involved sharp theoretical disputes. Gould's detractors, like Dawkins and John Maynard Smith, criticized him heavily over things like multi-level selection.
The argument over whether selection operates only at the level of the gene or if it also occurs at higher levels, like the organism, the species, or even entire clades.
And this conflict became especially fraught because critics argued that Gould, through his popular essays, was giving non-biologists a largely false picture of the state of evolutionary theory.
Which inevitably led to a dangerous outcome: the misuse of his work by creationists.
They saw an opening.
They did. They took Gould's honest scientific acknowledgments, like the lack of continuous transitional forms in some records, and misquoted him to support the idea that evolution itself was unsupported. Gould was forced to repeatedly and publicly correct the creationist misuse of punctuated equilibrium, clarifying emphatically that PE was a theory about evolution, not an argument against it.
He used one final, powerful piece of evidence to reinforce his concept of contingency and the central role of chance in evolution. The Cambrian fauna of the Burgess Shale.
Detailed in his 1989 book, Wonderful Life, he described these fossils, which are roughly 505 million years old, emphasizing their bizarre anatomical designs and their sudden, explosive appearance. He used the sheer strangeness of this fauna to stress the massive role contingency plays in shaping the broad pattern of life.
The famous rewind the tape of life thought experiment.
Yes. Gould argued that if you could rewind the tape of life back to the Cambrian and play it forward again, the outcome would almost certainly be radically different. The survival of certain lineages was, in his view, a historical accident, not an inevitability, meaning the appearance of intelligent life like us was far from guaranteed.
But this view was strongly critiqued by figures like paleontologist Simon Conway Morris.
Morris countered that actually convergent evolution acts as a potent channel. He argued that physical and chemical constraints are so rigid that they channel life forms down similar paths.
Where unrelated organisms evolve similar solutions like eyes or wings.
Exactly. Morris suggested that even if you rewind the tape, the appearance of human-like animals, beings capable of high-level cognition, is actually quite likely, if not inevitable, because intelligence is a predictable evolutionary solution.
It's a classic profound division in evolutionary thought. Gould stressing the historical accident, and Morris stressing the predictable, deterministic results of physical constraints.
A debate about destiny versus chance in the history of life.
To wrap up Gould's comprehensive intellectual output, we have to address his attempt to formulate a framework for peace in the seemingly endless conflict between science and religion.
Yes, his concept of non-overlapping Magisteria, or NOMA. He presented it in his 1999 book, Rocks of Ages, defining it as a blessedly simple and entirely conventional resolution to the conflict.
To understand NOMA, we first have to define a magisterium.
It's a domain where one form of teaching holds the appropriate tools and authority for meaningful discourse. And Gould proposed a clean intellectual separation. On one side, you have the science magisterium,
Which covers the empirical realm, what the universe is factually made of, why it works the way it does.
Exactly. It deals with the material world and observable evidence. And on the other side, you have the religion magisterium,
Which covers questions of ultimate meaning, moral value, spiritual purpose, and ethics.
And Gould asserted that these two domains do not overlap. Science cannot tell you how to live, and religion cannot pronounce on the factual composition of rocks.
But this seemingly neat division was immediately attacked, wasn't it?
Oh, immediately. Richard Dawkins, for example, argued fiercely against NOMA. His central counter-argument was that the division is impossible because most major religions make claims about factual, empirical events, miracles, resurrections, divine intervention, which, by definition, violate the principles of the science magisterium.
Once religion claims a historical or material fact, the overlap is immediate.
And undeniable. Dawkins also opposed the idea that religion held a monopoly on morality, a point echoed by the philosopher Paul Kurtz. Kurtz argued that scientific inquiry can provide a superior foundation for determining moral principles than relying on ancient texts.
It's interesting because Gould's own personal stance on morality, which he had clarified years earlier, was perhaps more sophisticated than NOMA sometimes suggested.
It was. He maintained that nature itself contains no inherent moral messages framed in human terms. Morality is a complex construct for philosophers and thinking people, and the answers cannot arise passively from scientific data alone. It's a statement that reflects his training as both a naturalist and a philosopher.
His professional life culminated in a final, massive undertaking, the structure of evolutionary theory.
Published in 2002, just 2 months before his death. This wasn't a popular science book. This was a dense, 1,400-page treatise for professionals. It was meant to be the single source synthesizing his comprehensive, pluralistic view of how evolution operates.
And the ultimate measure of his academic success is his citation impact. It's still immense.
Oh, huge. He's one of the most frequently cited scientists in evolutionary theory. In paleobiology, the top journal in his specialty, only Darwin and George Gaylord Simpson are cited more often, and he was universally respected as a meticulous historian of science.
And his legacy is also defined by his commitment to transdisciplinary work. He co-founded the Art Science Research Laboratory, or ASRL, with his wife, Rhonda Roland Shearer.
Specifically to support interdisciplinary inquiry, showing his belief that the humanities and the sciences should inform one another. He even applied his scientific eye to art, examining Marcel Duchamp's use of optics and perception.
Stephen Jay Gould was, well, an unrelenting intellectual force. He achieved two remarkable feats at once. He forced the professional scientific community to rigorously clean up its assumptions about gradualism, adaptation, and progress,
While ensuring that the complexity, the wonder, and the sheer intellectual adventure of those scientific ideas were accessible to millions of general readers worldwide. He fundamentally changed what it means to be an evolutionary biologist.
So as you reflect on this giant of modern thought, consider this provocative question based on Gould's revolutionary concept of the spandrel.
Gould argued that evolution is full of useful features that were merely unintended byproducts of some other primary decision.
Right, so if we apply this spandrel's idea more broadly to modern human endeavors in our political systems, our technologies, our cultural norms, how many of the features we currently celebrate as brilliant design or optimization or high achievement are actually just fascinating, lucky byproducts of some entirely accidental initial decision that was made for a completely different reason?
Something to chew on as you navigate the complexities of design and consequence in your own world.